During World War II, no one took this position seriously. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a fortified line. It wasn't even defended by a large force. To enemy commanders, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned stretch of road. Reports described it as safe. Maps marked it as clear. The soldier responsible for this area wasn't a famous officer. He had no special equipment, no reinforcements, and no authority to change the plan. What he did have was time, and one simple idea. When the enemy finally moved through this sector, they didn't slow down. They didn't spread out. They didn't expect resistance. Minutes later, an entire unit was gone, not because of superior firepower, but because of a trap no one thought was worth worrying about. The soldier at the center of this story was not supposed to be important. He wasn't a decorated officer. He wasn't leading a famous unit, and his name never appeared in official plans for major operations. On paper, he was responsible for a quiet sector, a narrow road running through rough terrain that commanders considered insignificant. Supply trucks passed through it occasionally, patrols moved along it without caution, and enemy reconnaissance rarely bothered to study it closely. To higher command, this area didn't look like a threat. It wasn't a frontline position, it wasn't heavily defended, and it wasn't expected to see serious combat. That was exactly the problem. The soldier assigned there had watched enemy movements for weeks. He noticed patterns others ignored, how units moved in columns instead of spreading out, how vehicles slowed at the same points, how soldiers relaxed once they believed they were beyond danger. He reported what he saw. Those reports were dismissed. Command believed the enemy would never commit real forces through such a minor route. Any danger, they said, would come from the main roads, not this forgotten stretch of ground. But the soldier stayed. With limited supplies and no reinforcements, he began studying the terrain instead of the enemy. The slopes, the curves in the road, the points where visibility dropped, the places where noise echoed and movement became restricted. What he understood was simple. The road itself could become a weapon. He didn't have the firepower to stop a unit head-on. He didn't have enough men to fight openly, and he wasn't allowed to change orders. So he stopped thinking like a defender and started thinking like someone setting a trap. By the time enemy commanders finally decided to move a unit through this safe sector, the soldier had already turned the landscape into something very different from what the map showed, and they were about to walk straight into it. The trap itself was not complicated. That was what made it effective. The soldier didn't build fortifications. He didn't dig new trenches or prepare heavy weapons. Everything he used was already there: the road, the terrain, and the enemy's habits. He focused on one thing: timing. The road narrowed at a specific point, forcing vehicles and infantry to compress into a tight formation. On both sides, the ground was soft and uneven, making it difficult to leave the road quickly. Dense vegetation limited visibility to just a few meters in either direction. This was where movement slowed naturally. Instead of blocking the road completely, he made subtle changes, obstacles that looked accidental. Fallen branches repositioned just enough to reduce maneuvering space. Shallow ground disturbances that guided vehicles into predictable paths. Nothing that would raise suspicion. From a distance, the road looked unchanged. More importantly, the soldier understood the enemy's mindset. Units moving through safe sectors did not expect resistance. They didn't deploy scouts aggressively. They didn't spread out. They trusted previous reports more than their instincts. That trust was the key. Positions were prepared quietly along the tree line. Not many, just enough. The goal was not to stop the unit immediately, but to control the moment when everything would collapse. When the enemy unit finally entered the sector, it moved exactly as expected. The columns stayed tight. Vehicles followed the same tracks. Soldiers walked without urgency. Weapons were carried low. Conversation was casual. No alarms were raised. The soldier waited. Not for the lead element to appear, but for the center of the column to reach the narrowest point. That was when retreat would be hardest and confusion would spread fastest. When the signal finally came, it was brief. A few controlled shots, targeted, deliberate. Not enough to warn the entire column at once, just enough to break its rhythm. Within seconds, movement stopped. Vehicles blocked each other. Soldiers instinctively sought cover that didn't exist. Orders were shouted, but there was no clear direction to move. The road that had seemed harmless moments earlier had become a trap with no obvious exit. And now, the enemy had to react inside it. By the time the enemy understood what was happening, there was no clear way out. The first instinct was to push forward, but the narrow road was already blocked. Disabled vehicles and stalled movement turned the column into a solid mass of men and equipment. Turning back was no easier. Fire now came from behind as well. What had seemed like isolated shots quickly revealed themselves as part of a wider plan. Every attempt to regroup exposed another weakness. Every movement drew more fire. Panic did not arrive all at once. It spread in fragments. Small groups tried to break away from the road, only to sink into soft ground or become separated from one another. Communication collapsed almost immediately. Officers shouted orders that could not be heard or followed. Runners sent to relay messages never returned. The trap worked because it forced the enemy to react blindly. They were no longer fighting an opponent they could see. They were fighting the space around them, the road, the forest, the terrain that now controlled every decision they tried to make. Resistance weakened quickly. Some soldiers attempted to surrender once it became clear that escape was impossible. Others fought until ammunition ran out. Within minutes, the unit had ceased to exist as an organized force. When the firing stopped, the silence returned. What remained on the road told the story clearly. Abandoned weapons, disabled vehicles, wounded men calling for help. No clear line of advance, no clear line of retreat. For enemy command, the loss was sudden and confusing. Reports failed to explain how an entire unit had vanished in an area considered safe. There had been no major battle, no warning signs, no obvious mistake. At least, not one that appeared on maps. But the mistake was simple. They ignored the possibility that something ordinary could be turned into a weapon. The soldier who prepared the trap did not rely on strength or numbers. He relied on patience, observation, and the assumption that the enemy would do exactly what they had always done. And they did. That was enough. What made this incident especially effective was how ordinary it appeared afterward. There were no dramatic reports, no famous last stands, and no clear moment that stood out in official records. From a distance, it looked like another routine loss in a war filled with them. But for those who studied the battlefield later, the lesson was clear. The unit had not been defeated by superior numbers or overwhelming firepower. It had been defeated by predictability. Every decision it made followed expectations. Every movement fit a pattern that had already been observed and prepared for. The trap succeeded because nothing unexpected happened, except the outcome. In many ways, this was how the war was truly fought. Not only through massive offensives and famous commanders, but through small, calculated actions that exploited habits and assumptions. The road remained just a road. The forest remained just a forest. But for the soldiers who entered that space, it became the moment when routine turned into disaster, and when a simple idea proved more powerful than force.